Her name was Natalie Foster. She was 38, living in a high-rise apartment in Seattle, and 2 weeks ago, something happened that still doesn't make sense, no matter how many times the story is told. She was sitting on the couch with her husband, watching a late-night movie. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just another quiet evening that felt safe and predictable. Then her phone rang. It was her sister. The voice on the other end was shaking, urgent, almost breaking. She said her husband had been in a serious accident. She said he was in surgery, and she needed to come immediately. Natalie actually laughed at first. She turned her head and looked straight at her husband sitting right beside her. Calm, alive, completely fine. She told her sister it was impossible, that there had to be a mistake, that he was right there in front of her, but her sister didn't back down. Sss. She kept insisting, her voice getting tighter, more desperate, telling her to just come and see for herself. So Natalie went. And when she walked into that hospital, when she followed that hallway and stepped inside that room, her entire body went cold because she saw him. Not once, twice. Before we go any further, I want you to tell me what time it is, where you are right now, and which city you're watching from, so I know how far this story is reaching. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Because stories like this only get more intense from here. That night didn't start as anything unusual, and nothing about it suggested it would become the moment everything began to shift. Natalie Foster had built a life that felt stable after years of distance from her family, a quiet routine inside a modern apartment overlooking the city, where most nights were predictable and controlled. Her husband, Caleb Foster, worked as a consultant for tech firms, which meant he was often traveling, sometimes gone for days, sometimes returning without much notice. But when he was home, they kept things simple: dinners, late movies, small conversations that didn't require effort. That evening followed the same pattern: dim lights, the sound of a film playing, his presence beside her, steady enough that she didn't question anything until her phone interrupted it. The call came from her sister, Rachel Dunn, someone she hadn't fully trusted since their childhood, but still answered out of habit. The moment Natalie heard her voice, something felt off, not the words at first, but the tone, strained, urgent, like she was trying to hold something together. Rachel said Caleb had been in a serious accident and was already in surgery, that the situation was critical and she needed to come immediately. Natalie didn't react with fear. She reacted with disbelief, turning her head toward Caleb, sitting inches away. Alive, focused on screen, unaware of what was being said about him. She told Rachel it wasn't possible, that there had to be confusion, that she was looking right at him. Caleb noticed the shift in her expression and reached for the phone, his movements calm, controlled, asking questions in a steady voice. Not panicked, not rushed, just measured, as if he was analyzing a situation that didn't belong to him. After a short exchange, he handed the phone back and said it was likely a mistake, that hospitals mixed up identities more often than people realized. But there was something in his eyes that didn't match his words. Not fear, not concern, something more distant, like he was waiting to see what she would do next. He suggested she go anyway, framing it as a way to calm her sister, and Natalie agreed, not because she believed the story, but because ignoring it felt harder than confirming it. The drive across the city felt longer than usual, traffic lights stretching the distance. Her thoughts moving in circles, that never settled into a clear conclusion, repeating the same idea that Caleb was at home, that nothing was wrong, that this would end as quickly as it started. When she arrived at the hospital, Rachel was already there, her face pale, eyes red, the kind of expression that didn't leave room for doubt. And, without saying much, she led Natalie through a corridor filled with movement, medical staff passing by, doors opening and closing, the environment carrying a weight that made everything feel more real than it should have been. They stopped outside a restricted area where a doctor approached. "I'm in shock," confirming her identity before explaining that her husband had been brought in after an accident and had undergone emergency surgery, that he was stable but still unconscious. Natalie didn't argue, didn't question immediately. She just followed as the door opened, stepping into the room where the man lay on the bed, connected to machines. His face partially covered, but still unmistakable. It was Caleb, every detail aligned. The structure of his face, the familiar lines she had seen for years, even the small mark near his eyebrow that couldn't be explained away. Her body reacted before her mind could process it. A sudden drop in stability that forced her to reach for support, because less than an hour earlier, she had left that same face behind in her living room. When she returned home, everything looked exactly the same. But nothing felt the same anymore. Natalie stepped inside and immediately saw Caleb in the living room, standing, as if he had been waiting for her. His posture relaxed yet attentive, in a way that felt slightly too controlled. He asked if she was all right, his tone warm and steady, and when he pulled her into a brief embrace, there was nothing physically wrong. Nothing she could point to, yet something inside her refused to settle. She didn't mention what she had seen at the hospital, not directly, instead choosing to observe, to listen, to let the silence stretch, just long enough to notice how he filled it. Caleb moved naturally through the space, offering her water, adjusting the lights, speaking about ordinary things. But Natalie found herself focusing on details she had never paid attention to before, the timing of his responses, the way he paused before answering certain questions, the slight delay when she brought up memories they both shared. None of it was obvious enough to accuse, yet none of it felt completely right. Later that night, as they sat across from each other at the table, she mentioned a small event from their past, something insignificant, testing without making it obvious, and Caleb responded correctly, but the answer came with a fraction of hesitation, as if he had to retrieve it rather than remember it. That moment stayed with her longer than it should have. Over the next few days, Natalie kept her routine, unchanged on the surface, while quietly paying attention to everything beneath it. Caleb continued to behave like himself. He knew their habits, their schedules, even the smallest preferences. Yet, there were moments where his reactions felt rehearsed instead of instinctive, where his expressions seemed to arrive a second too late. She stopped sharing what she was thinking with anyone, including Rachel, choosing instead to visit the hospital alone. Standing at a distance from the room where the other Caleb remained unconscious, connected to machines, monitored by staff who treated him without question as her husband. Each visit made the contradiction harder to ignore, because both realities continued without collapsing into a single explanation. At home, Caleb would ask simple questions about her day, and she would answer carefully, measuring her words, watching how he processed them, noticing that sometimes he mirrored her tone instead of responding naturally. One evening, she deliberately changed a small detail in a story she had told before. Something subtle, and he accepted it without correction, a reaction that confirmed something deeper than confusion. Didn't react outwardly, she simply adjusted, speaking less, observing more, allowing him to believe everything was normal, while her understanding of the situation shifted into something colder and more precise. Days passed, but nothing in her life settled into anything that felt stable or certain. Natalie continued moving through her routine with careful precision, maintaining normal conversations at home, while quietly increasing the time she spent away, creating space to observe without interference. Each visit to the hospital added a new layer of tension, not because anything changed, but because nothing did. The man in the bed remained in the same condition, monitored, documented, treated as Caleb without hesitation by every member of the staff. She began paying attention to the details she had ignored before. The identification records, the consistency of the medical reports, the way his information appeared in the system without discrepancies. All of it aligning in a way that made denial impossible. At the same time, the version of Caleb at home continued to function within their life with unsettling accuracy, responding to her actions, adapting to her tone, maintaining a presence that felt increasingly calculated rather than natural. Natalie stopped testing him directly and shifted her focus toward gathering information without drawing attention, checking shared accounts, reviewing small financial activities, noticing minor changes that didn't immediately stand out, but formed a pattern when viewed together. It was during this shift that Rachel became more involved, not through direct confrontation, but through observation and quiet questions that suggested she had begun to notice inconsistencies as well. Wins. Their conversations were brief and controlled, often happening outside the apartment, where Natalie felt more comfortable speaking, without being overheard. Rachel didn't offer conclusions. At first, she asked about behaviors, about timing, about anything that felt different, building a picture piece by piece instead of forcing a single explanation. Natalie shared only what she could confirm, avoiding speculation. Yet even that limited information was enough to change the way Rachel responded, her tone becoming more serious, more focused, as if she was already connecting details that Natalie hadn't fully processed. One afternoon, Rachel mentioned something specific, a detail about Caleb's recent activity that didn't align with known records. Something small but precise, and instead of dismissing it, Natalie began to see how many similar gaps existed beneath the surface. From that point forward, their approach shifted from confusion to quiet coordination. Meeting at irregular times, avoiding predictable patterns, treating every conversation as something that needed to remain contained. At home, Natalie adjusted her behavior again, reducing emotional responses, keeping interactions neutral, giving nothing away that could suggest she was questioning anything, while internally tracking every reaction, every delay, every moment that reinforced the growing certainty that what she was living with was not what it appeared to be. One evening, Rachel asked her to come alone, and the way she said it made it clear this was no longer about suspicion, but something far more concrete. Natalie arrived at a small office space Rachel had access to through her work, a quiet environment removed from anything connected to her home, where every word could be spoken without hesitation. Rachel didn't begin with explanations. She handed over a tablet and let the information speak for itself, a collection of records, access logs, and identity. Verification reports that had been pulled from multiple systems. At first, it looked like scattered data. But as Natalie moved through it, patterns started to form. Repeated access points, duplicated credentials, and subtle modifications tied to Caleb's identity that had been executed over time, rather than all at once. Rachel explained how she had traced irregularities in financial activity and cross-referenced them with login histories, uncovering that certain actions attributed to Caleb had originated from locations that didn't align with his known movements. The deeper they went, the more structured the manipulation appeared. Not random, not rushed, but deliberate, planned with an understanding of how identity systems worked and how to avoid detection. Then, Rachel brought up a name, Jordan Blake. Someone connected to Caleb through past business dealings. Someone who had maintained limited but consistent contact over the years. The records showed repeated overlaps between Jordan's access points and the altered data, connections that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Natalie felt the shift immediately, not just because of the name, but because it filled a gap she hadn't been able to define. A missing piece that made everything else align. Rachel continued, explaining that this wasn't about physical resemblance alone. The evidence suggested a coordinated effort to replicate Caleb's identity across multiple layers, financial, digital, and legal, creating a version of him that could operate independently while still being recognized as legitimate. There were documents showing authorization changes, permissions transferred, accounts updated with subtle modifications that wouldn't trigger alerts, but would gradually shift control. Natalie realized that the man living in her apartment didn't just know Caleb's life. He had access to it in ways that went far beyond memory. Rachel pointed out one final detail, a timeline showing that the data manipulation began well before the incident that placed Caleb in the hospital, indicating that the event itself was part of a larger plan rather than an isolated occurrence. Natalie didn't react immediately. She absorbed the information in silence, her thoughts moving from confusion into clarity, because for the first time, everything she had experienced had a structure that could be understood. The hesitation, the precision, the calculated responses, none of it was accidental. It was constructed. She didn't confront him, and that decision changed the direction of everything that followed. Natalie returned to the apartment with a level of control she hadn't shown before, adjusting her behavior not out of fear, but with intention, maintaining the same routines while removing any trace of emotional reaction that could draw attention. She spoke less, observed more, and allowed Caleb to continue moving through their shared space without resistance, creating the impression that nothing had shifted while internally restructuring how she responded to every interaction. At the same time, she and Rachel expanded their efforts, no longer focused on identifying inconsistencies, but on documenting them in a way that could be verified beyond their own observations. Rachel arranged contact with someone she trusted, Detective Mark Ellison, who agreed to review the information without formal involvement at first, examining the records, timelines, and access patterns that had already been collected. Natalie met him in a neutral location, presenting what they had without exaggeration, allowing the details to stand on their own. He didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to ask precise questions about sequences, behaviors, and the connection between the incident involving Caleb and the changes in his identity records, building a framework that aligned with what Rachel had already uncovered. From that point forward, the process shifted into something structured. Natalie, continuing her role inside the apartment, while Rachel and the detective worked externally to verify the scope of the manipulation. Natalie began securing access to shared devices, copying files, capturing timestamps, and documenting interactions in ways that would hold up under scrutiny, careful to avoid anything that could alert Caleb to what she was doing. She adjusted small aspects of her routine to create opportunities, leaving devices unattended just long enough to track activity, noting patterns in when certain systems were accessed, and identifying moments where his behavior aligned with changes occurring elsewhere. Was deliberate, measured, and contained, because any mistake would risk collapsing the entire process before it was complete. The more evidence they gathered, the clearer the structure became. Not just isolated actions, but a coordinated effort that extended across multiple systems, each part reinforcing the other, in a way that allowed the identity to function without interruption. Detective Ellison eventually confirmed that what they were seeing was consistent with a deliberate identity takeover, not a spontaneous event, but something built over time, with access, knowledge, and intent. Natalie absorbed that confirmation without outward reaction, continuing to maintain the same neutral presence at home, while internally shifting further away from the person she had been only days earlier. She no longer questioned what she was seeing. She focused on what needed to be done next, aligning her actions with the timelines, with the timeline being developed outside her apartment, preparing for the moment when everything would need to be presented at once. The meeting had already been arranged, and everything was set to move forward, exactly as planned. Natalie sat at the conference table with a calm expression, reviewing documents that outlined the transfer of financial authority, a process Caleb had been encouraging for weeks, presenting it as a necessary step for managing their shared assets more efficiently. Across from her, the man wearing Caleb's face appeared confident, composed, fully expecting the situation to conclude without resistance. Rachel was present as well, positioned quietly to the side, while two legal representatives prepared the final paperwork. Nothing in the room suggested interruption, and that was precisely what made the moment work. Natalie picked up the pen, held it for a second longer than necessary, then set it back down and asked for the screen in the room to be turned on, her tone steady, controlled, leaving no room for argument. Without waiting for permission, she connected the device Rachel had provided, and within seconds, a series of records began to display: access logs, identity verification conflicts, financial inconsistencies, each one organized in a sequence that revealed the structure behind what had been happening. The shift in the room was immediate, the confidence across from her breaking into visible tension as the information continued to unfold, each detail removing another layer of denial. Natalie didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse directly. She let the evidence speak, allowing the pattern to become undeniable without forcing the conclusion. When the final set of data appeared, linking Jordan to the entire operation, the reaction was no longer controlled. His composure collapsed, and for the first time, there was no attempt to maintain the role he had been playing. The door opened before he could respond, and Detective Ellison entered with two officers, moving with the kind of certainty that only comes when everything has already been confirmed. The room shifted from private discussion to formal intervention in seconds, and every piece of evidence that had been collected over the past weeks was now presented within a framework that could not be dismissed or explained away. Jordan, attempted to speak, to redirect, to challenge the claims, but each response was met with documentation that closed every possible exit, leaving no space for interpretation. The charges outlined against him were direct: identity manipulation, financial exploitation, and coordination of the incident that had placed Caleb in the hospital, all supported by records that had been verified across multiple systems. Natalie remained seated throughout the process, watching without reaction as the situation, the Zechuen, unfolded exactly as it had been prepared. The person who had been living in her home no longer able to maintain the illusion he had built. He was escorted out of the room without further resistance. The silence that followed, carrying more weight than anything that had been said. The legal process continued beyond that moment, moving through the system in a way that ensured every action he had taken was accounted for, resulting in a sentence that removed him completely from any possibility of returning to the life he had tried to take. When Natalie visited the hospital again, Caleb had regained consciousness, but the recovery ahead of him was uncertain, not defined by a single moment, but by a long process that would change the way his life moved forward. She stood beside him, not with relief, but with clarity, understanding that what had happened could not be undone simply by knowing the truth. In the weeks that followed, she made decisions without hesitation, separating herself from everything that had been built under false conditions, refusing to return to a version of life that no longer felt real. She did not reconnect with her past, did not rebuild what had been broken, because for her, the experience had made one thing clear: trust is not something that can be restored once it has been systematically replaced with something artificial. It can only be recognized for what it was and left behind.